Okay, so we will finish up by talking about factorial ANOVAs, and of course it will build upon what we've been doing. Now the general idea with a one-way ANOVA was that we were using variance to compare three or more groups, and that built upon what we did with t-test. Built upon it because we were now able to use three or more groups, but we still had one independent variable. So factorial ANOVAs add a layer of complexity because now we have multiple independent variables, or ANOVA nomenclature, multiple factors, meaning factorial ANOVA. So up to this point, all the analyses we've used just used one independent variable, but they had different levels depending on the test we were talking about. So with t-test, it was one independent variable, but we had two groups. Here's a couple of examples below. When we did one-way ANOVAs, we still had one independent variable. We just had three or more groups. A couple of examples there. So we are now moving out of the situation because now we're adding multiple independent variables. So two or more independent variables, and each independent variable is going to have some levels to it. 2 levels, 3 levels. We'll look at that in a minute. But here's an example of a word problem that would indicate a factorial ANOVA. So let's say there's a researcher who recruits a sample of students, a sample of psychology students, and a sample of biology students. So there's two groups. Now half of each group gets a drug that's aimed to improve working memory. The other half gets a placebo. So the researcher gives all the participants some sort of task and then records their scores on the task. So just by looking at this from a word problem perspective, we can see that there are two independent variables. So one of these is group. We're looking at the psychology students and the biology students. Then the other one here is looking at the drug versus the placebo. So we have two things to account for, two independent variables. So what we have here is what is known as a 2 by 2 factorial ANOVA. And so the numbers that you see, 2 by 2, those stand for the levels within the independent variables. So in the 2 by 2 factorial, one of these represents one independent variable, the other represents another. Here, order certainly doesn't matter. But our first independent variable, let's just say that's the psychology or the biology. Those are the levels, two levels within one independent variable. For the other one here, again, we had the drug independent variable. There's the drug versus the placebo, two levels. Now each of the places, so basically each thing on the side of an X in this nomenclature represents an independent variable. So here we have one IV, one factor, one independent variable. Here we have the second. Now it does not matter about the order here. The actual number that you see there, though, is going to represent the levels within each independent variable or each factor. So if we said we had a 3 by 3 ANOVA, what does that mean? Two independent variables, and then we had 3 levels in both. For a 2 by 2 ANOVA, that's the one we just did. We've got 2 independent variables, 2 levels in both. Now for 4 by 2, we still have 2 independent variables, 4 levels in one of them, and then 2 levels in the other independent variable. Now what if we had a 3 by 2 by 3 ANOVA? That would be 3 independent variables, 1, 2, 3, and 3 levels in one of these independent variables. Two levels in the second, and then 3 levels back in the third. So you can see where they all come from, hopefully. So the purpose of these factorial ANOVAs is to Go beyond what we did with one-way ANOVAs and now examine the effect that two or more factors or independent variables have on a single dependent variable. There are three questions that are being answered within a factorial ANOVA. And there can be more if you have more than this IV. So let's just say that this is specific to where you have two IVs. Three questions. One is there a difference somewhere between the groups on the first one, the second independent variable, and then do they interact? So those are three questions we could have. Now if we had three independent variables, we just say there's four questions. Are there differences between the levels on independent variable 1? Are there differences on the levels of independent variable 2? Are there differences on the levels of independent variable 3? And we'd still be able to ask about interactions. But let's just say we're asking about two independent variables. So let's visualize what this would look like. So let's come up with a new example. This is a 2 by 2 factorial ANOVA. So a researcher recruits a sample, places them in two groups. One group gets a placebo, one group gets a new drug. Okay, very straightforward. There's one independent variable there. Whatever this grouping variable is, the levels are placebo and drug. Additionally, the researcher gives half in each group cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, and the other half in each group no treatment. So there we see a second independent variable identified, some sort of treatment grouping variable, where one level is no treatment, the other level is CBT. And then the researcher is going to look at how many depressive symptoms each of these potential groups have. So the questions, let's break down the questions that are being asked within Factorial ANOVA. So the first one here is looking at the first independent variable. Independent variable 1, is there a difference between drug versus placebo on those depressive symptoms, which is again that dependent variable. Second question, are there differences between CBT versus the no treatment group, that's the second independent variable, on depressive symptoms. So answering those two questions, each independent variable is examined for what we call a main effect. All a main effect means is that there are differences between the levels of that independent variable. So if there are significant differences between the levels of an independent variable, then it means it matters what level those people in that group are in. So we say if it does matter which group you're in on that independent variable, so in other words, if it matters whether you're in the placebo or the drug group, then that independent variable, that factor, has a main effect. So again, here's the example. Looking at the example of the word problem we just started with, if there is a significant difference between the placebo and drug group on depression, then that main effect, there's a main effect of that independent variable, which is drug type, on depression. That's all we mean by main effect. And we can visualize that. Main effects are simply really analyzing just one independent variable at a time. Now you've got multiple things going on. So let's break this down. So almost the textbook definition is a main effect is that there are differences between levels of one independent variable when averaged across levels of the second independent variable. That's sort of the fancier speak for it, but really all that means is there a difference between these two levels? So in our example, is there a difference between placebo and drug group regardless of the other group, which we don't have pictured here yet? That's all a main effect means. Now if we do picture it, let's put in the independent variable 2, which is our treatment independent variable. So there are 4 cells here. Again, that would make sense. In a 2 by 2 factorial, we have 4 cells. So these each represent a group. So just based on how this was designed, some people, there are 4 really specific groups created here, and someone's going to fall in these groups. And when we say there's a main effect of that drug type independent variable, or what we're calling independent variable 1, basically that's saying that there's a significant difference between the placebo and drug groups. So we say there's a main effect of that IV, of that independent variable. Now, again, this means you're basically doing this ignoring the second independent variable. When there's a main effect of drug type, that means it doesn't matter what treatment they got. We really don't care about independent variable 2. So whether you're in that no treatment group or the CBT treatment group, it doesn't matter. There's a significant difference between placebo and drug on the drug type independent variable. That's really all a main effect says. Now we can do the other one too. So we can say that if there are significant differences on the other independent variable, treatment type, if we say there's a difference between the no treatment group and the CBT treatment group, regardless of what drug type they had, again, we don't care about independent variable 1. If there's a significant difference between the levels on independent variable 2 treatment type, then we say we have a main effect of treatment. So we can have multiple main effects going on at the same time. We can have it for both of the independent variables, or if we have a really complex factorial ANOVA with 3 groups, 4 groups, not groups, excuse me, 3 independent variables, 4 independent variables, 5 independent variables, however many independent variables there are, they could all have a main effect going on at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. The third question gets a little more complex here, and I'm actually going to break the video here just to make sure that I can sort of chop these up by topic.